Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech's CEO Conversation Show. Today we speak to Shaun Gregorio, CEO and founder of Frontier Digital Ventures. Now, Frontier Digital Ventures is listed on the Australian Stock Exchange and has a portfolio of companies spanning across Asia, Africa, and South America, mainly around property, automotive, and general marketplace websites. Now, welcome to the show, Shaun.
Hey Brian, how you doing?
Now, Shaun, let's start by you walking us through what Frontier Digital Ventures does and how you started this business.
Yeah, so we invest in and operate online marketplaces in emerging markets. So as you mentioned, it's property portals, it's automotive portals, and some general classifieds. We focus on some key emerging regions, being Latin America. We have quite a big presence there. We're also in large chunks of Asia, Southeast Asia, and we are also across the MENA region. So I guess if I go back to how all that came to be, been involved in online classifieds for a long time. I ran a business called the REA Group. I was general manager of a large group of property portals, which was based in Melbourne in Australia. During the last decade or so, the early part of the century, we'd invested in a lot more markets overseas. And that then led me to Kuala Lumpur, where I'm based today. So 11 years ago, I made the move from Melbourne to Kuala Lumpur, and that was to run a business called the Property Group. People in Malaysia and across the region might be familiar with the Property Group. We ran property portals in a number of countries across Southeast Asia. We also got involved in automotive portals around that time with iCar Asia. So I was on the board of that company while I was CEO of the Property Group, and that eventually led us to FTV, and we've been running FTV since about 2014.
So that hypothesis and from your experience that you had in these two verticals, and you realized that in frontier markets, you wanted to be first movers. Is that how your hypothesis was formed together with Patrick?
Yeah, look, having run the REA Group, which is mostly developed markets, we'd got some emerging market exposure, and we saw that the model could work in emerging markets as well. This was a model that had worked really well in developed markets, and that's online classifieds. We had a view that, well, if it could work in emerging markets in Asia, it could probably work in emerging markets around the globe. It was around that time that we were running iProperty, and iProperty had started to, in business terms, succeed and become a scalable, quite a large business. And it was with that we thought, well, this should work in other places. We'd started investing privately in places like the Middle East and Brazil, saw this model starting to work, and we thought to ourselves, well, there's a real opportunity here to run these sorts of businesses in more markets, and why not let it be us? We didn't see any reason why we couldn't do it from here in Mid-Valley in KL.
Now, tell us about your iProperty journey and what were the key lessons that you learned from there that were fundamentally different from your REA experience?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, when we ran REA was an outstanding success story in terms of a business. It really was an early achiever in that model, and it had grown really quickly. I ran that business. I think when I started, we had $5 million Aussie dollars in revenue. When I left, we had about 200. So it had grown, stratospherically. And we kind of thought, gee, we can do this in many, many places. And we'd started doing it. I came up to KL with a view that that model that we'd run in Australia would simply work in Southeast Asia. And for a little while, we thought it did. But to be fair, the different culture, different style of doing things, different market structures, the economics are different. A lot of it didn't work. And I think one of the great learnings of that was that, success doesn't bequeath success. You do actually have to look at a market and think, just because I'm successful in market A, I can't automatically roll into market B and think that I can, use the same playbook, use the same strategies, the same model, and it will automatically work. And I think globally with our model, which is this online marketplace model, the big mistake that a lot of companies have made is to assume that success in one country automatically guarantees success where you go and do it in another country. And when I came up to run, I probably suffered from a little bit of that, a little bit of hubris coming out of a successful business, and really had to get my head into the markets here and understand local customs and the local way of doing things, because at the end of the day, these businesses are also very local businesses. They're not actually international businesses. These are a series of domestic businesses put in the same bucket to form a group. There's not a lot that happens cross-border. So yeah, certainly coming out of a very successful business, coming into a business, iProperty at the time, that was really struggling. It took us some time to figure out which version of what we'd learned was applicable and what we had to relearn and reapply. But over time of, it was close to four or 5 years, we got it right in the end. But it certainly was a great learning experience. And it just taught us that the core basis of our model was transportable into other markets. But, there's a whole range of factors that, and dependencies that would determine its success in new markets.
And also, Shaun, to add to your iProperty journey, you were much more successful and claimed market leadership positions in some markets versus other markets. Singapore and Malaysia being the example, where in Malaysia you claimed market leadership, but in Singapore, strong number 2 position.
Yeah, and there's this idea in classifieds that you can go into a market where there's a really strong leader, and if you spend enough and execute well enough, you'll automatically become the leader, and it just doesn't very often work. And we probably looked across the region. We had really strong leadership here in Malaysia. We had a really strong competitor in Singapore, who today is still the leader in Property Guru.
Yeah.
We went into Indonesia and went head to head, and with Property Guru, and they're still probably butting heads today. I don't think there is a clear outcome of that arm wrestle. We went into places like Hong Kong and Thailand, just similar stories. You really had to be a master of your art to execute your way from 2 or 3 to number 1, and it's really rare in our industry. So the lesson out of that is, we always say you kind of finish where you start. So if you start really well and you start as an early stage leader, 9 times out of 10, you'll probably win that market. It's a really difficult business to execute your way past a competitor if that competitor is as capable as you, or thereabouts. So yeah, it was a really interesting journey, and again taught us a lot in our industry about the power of incumbency. And as we've developed FDV today, that's been a real critical piece, where we only invest in market leaders, because we spent many years figuring out that not being a market leader wasn't much fun. It was really expensive, and it was actually really hard. So we did learn from those experiences, and hopefully applied those to our business today.
Shaun, I'm going to ask you, because you've got obviously a wide pool of experience to draw on because of how FDV is spread, has that hypothesis in terms of investing in the market leader only worked from a profitability standpoint?
Oh, most definitely. Market leaders are always more profitable in our industry. In fact, in most markets, the leader will get about 2/3 of the market, and in a lot of developed countries have margins of 50 to 70% on an EBITDA basis. So you can have great businesses as market leaders, and that is still evident today. In emerging markets, the margins are a bit less because the model's a bit less evolved or a bit less developed, but it is growing rapidly. And we just see the power of incumbency as being almost the number 1 attribute that you would look at. It's just not an industry where there's 3 or 4 equals. It's not like buying a car where there might be half a dozen models you can choose, or a pair of shoes, or a pair of furniture, or a professional service. In our industry, it's almost winner takes all. And look, that may change in the future, but as we sit here today, it's the number 1 predicator of long-term values. You've just got to be market leader.
Now, moving on, then it was iCar. And the iCar journey success has been a little bit less clear after obviously some early successes. What do you think the lessons have been learned from your iCar journey?
So yeah, I was on the iCar board for a number of years. And again, similar industry, cars, new cars and used cars. Property, you have new property and used property. You have car dealers and property agents. And we probably held a view that they were more similar than different. And of course, when you get into the car industry, somewhere like Malaysia, you've got a lot of very small dealers who operate their business on their phone. They're very informal, very unregulated in many respects. So when you try and overlay an industry like that with a better solution, technology-driven solution, it's a long haul to get adoption of that new product or solution. We thought we were solving a real problem, and I believe that's the case. But you had a very cottage industry. that you were saying, hey, we've got this wonderful solution that's going to blow you off your chair. You've just got to figure out how to use an iPad and a CRM system and how to upload your inventory, using, a digital camera. And meanwhile, these guys have been running their businesses quite happily from a phone and maybe a teledext and some help on their accounts. So it was quite a difficult thing to get into the industry. It certainly probably taught us that even when you've got well-founded assumptions, when you're trying to solve problems in early stage developing markets with technology, you are going to come across unexpected barriers and unexpected problems that'll probably, curtail your rosy and aggressive forecasts that you might have put around this business. When you just look at the industry and you look at the potential it has and you look at the value that's there and you overlay this technology solution, you go, hang on a minute, how come it's not getting traction? This is a great idea. And underlying that is maybe an industry that's, struggling to come to terms with it or finding it difficult to really implement new systems and processes. But look, that business has come a long way. It's evolved a lot. The technology is a lot better. And you won't find a car dealer in KL now who isn't using technology in one form or another to run their business better. And certainly from a consumer perspective, I'd much rather be buying a car today in Malaysia with all the choices I have.
Yes.
I arrived in 2010 and didn't know where to look first. So just from a consumer perspective, it's come a huge way, and it's a much more trusted transaction now buying a car in the region than it was, 10 years ago.
And that's a notoriously shonky industry in terms of some of the practices that they have. But what was your go-to-market strategy that eventually paid off from an adoption standpoint on the dealer side? Because as you mentioned, that was the tough sell.
Yeah, it was the realization that unless you had your product in front of the dealer all of the time, they just wouldn't engage with it. It just wasn't an habitual thing for them to look at a website and manage their inventory. And iCar ended up investing quite significantly in a CRM system that was a bespoke solution for the industry. It was customized to meet, used car dealers in KL that could be easily operated from their phone or an iPad. Its usability was really customized. It really was a dealer-focused piece of software that eventually more people used, and you had to give it away at first. And once you built something that was more about them than it was about you, so you weren't trying to force your solution on them, you were saying, well, we want to understand your problem better, and we want to build the solution to solve your problem, rather than us thrust our solution onto what we think is your problem. So it was probably a misalignment of their habits and the way they ran their businesses. But once you cracked that nut, it really was evident you were solving a problem for them, and hence that the business grew quite considerably after that.
And taking those lessons, then let's then zoom into your FDV and walk us through some of your portfolio companies and why you invested in them.
Yeah, I mean, so FDV, I'd been CEO of companies before I started FDV, and I guess from a personal perspective, you'd done very well for a lot of people, and we were very motivated to do something for ourselves, which is sort of a life ambition. So FDV looks at these same types of businesses, but in other emerging markets, and we've got a very big presence in LATAM, and we've got some great businesses there. We've got some great businesses in parts of Asia. The first business that we invested in is in Pakistan. So in 2000 and late 13, early 14. Pakistan was pretty wild. This was not one.
Still a frontier market today.
It's still very much a frontier market now, but sometimes perception and reality are a little bit different. And we invested from a distance into Pakistan, but we invested into two brothers who were running a business there, and they've done extremely well in building a property portal in Pakistan called Zumi. They dominate the market, and we were just super impressed with it's not an easy market, and it takes a lot of effort and determination and conscientiousness and tenacity to build a business in a market like Pakistan. And we were just super impressed with the two brothers who seem to have those qualities, and they've gone on to build a wonderful business there that's a real credit to them. Businesses we have in places like South America with Infocasas and Fincares, and these are great property portals again that have emerged as market leaders, and are doing some really innovative things And again, the hallmark of any of these businesses is that they're market leaders. And they're market leaders in markets that we think go unappreciated. So people say, why aren't you in India? And we say, well, we'd rather be in Pakistan. And people say, well, why aren't you in Brazil? And we say, well, we'd rather be in Colombia and Uruguay rather than, a big market like Brazil. So market leaders in markets that we think go underappreciated. And sometimes you get a lack of competition in those markets because everyone's chasing India, everyone's chasing Brazil. And one of our investment mandates is we don't like competition. So we'll go after those businesses in markets where we think there's a much clearer path to success and leadership.
Yeah, and obviously it's that same playbook of making sure that you establish number one positioning.
Absolutely. And again, one of those things we've seen some great businesses, some good businesses run by great guys, but their market position is a little way back. That said, when we look at businesses, what we value the most is the people running them. And we think, we'd say we'd rather have an amazing team in an average market and see what they can do than have an average team in the best market, and I don't think there's any magic to making it a great business in that sense. So absolute market leadership. If you can find a great team, then you've got a really potent, gathering of skills and opportunity, and that can make for really scalable businesses like Zameen and like Finca and our businesses in places like the Philippines and further afield in North Africa and places like Morocco, but all predicated around market leadership. Another feature of our investment strategy is we've tended to invest in founder-led businesses as well. We find that the energy and passion of founders is priceless. And we love that when they're really early stage. And again, a market leader in a market that people perhaps, have overlooked, where there's not much competition, driven by really passionate founders, it makes a really interesting journey and a really interesting recipe of how you put various factors together to try and find that key to building successful online businesses.
Now, which region are you most excited about long-term and why?
Well, this part of the world, Southeast Asia, has always been pretty close to my heart just because we're based here and we've had a lot of success here. We've been really lucky in that sense. I do love when I get to go to South America, to the LATAM countries. There's an amazing energy there. There's a real there's a real buzz in how people think, and I don't know whether it's just culturally that people are very excitable and very emotional and very passionate, and that plays through into how they run businesses. But there's always a lot of energy in that part of the world. There's so many smart, motivated entrepreneurs there. I think it's one of the underappreciated regions. We obsess a lot about Asia, and we obsess a lot about maybe Eastern Europe when it was coming out in the 90s and the early 2000s. But I just generally think that there are some really fantastic markets in LATAM that probably go under the radar a little bit from where we sit. Obviously, if you're in the US, it's probably a little more obvious, but certainly when you're all about Asia, and Asia, this part of the world just continues to deliver. There's not too many markets that aren't significantly better than they were a generation ago, but I do think there are some select markets in LATAM that are really exciting, and I really enjoy spending time with those teams.
Shaun, you manage a very diverse and geographically spread out portfolio of companies. What have been the key challenges in managing these companies?
I really wish I'd learned Spanish at school. I really wish I'd learned, about 6 different languages and maybe a mate in physics invented a time machine so I could travel. But the challenge for us, because we invest in businesses that are sort of similar from country to country, it's never been about the business, the model. It's always been about the cultural engagement with the market and being able to go into a market and not lose sight of the fact that, the model's sort of the same. It's like saying, well, an Uber in one country is the same as an Uber or Grab or whatever in another country, but 2 different drivers, 2 different sets of roads, 2 different ways of getting around. And if you think about our model, we go, you get a bunch of properties or cars on a website and you get people to come look and voila, what could go wrong? Just so many local factors that we've needed to be aware of. And, communication is a big one. We're in an industry where it relies on people and just getting used to the nuances, the cultural nuances, and sometimes they just blow away, well-held assumptions, whether it's about how things are done or whether it's about how you think a market's going to be when you go visit it. And I think about the first time I visited Pakistan, and I did so with some trepidation. And long story short, I was told I didn't need a visa. And when I got to the airport and I arrived, I found out I did need a visa, and I was actually pulled out of the line and taken and locked in a room for about 5 hours. And you go, that's my first entry to a country, and I've already messed up the entry process. The rest of this trip going to be like? Well, thankfully that resolved itself, but you have little adventures like that. But then spending time there, it's almost like you came away going, wow, I'm almost underwhelmed because it's so normal. And people are so normal and it's regular. And so you always get pleasant surprises like that. And I think just that your assumptions just continue to get shifted around by the experiences that you have when you're in so many different countries and get to meet so many different people.
Now, Shaun, how would you describe your leadership style and how has that evolved over the years? Because I'm sure it has.
Oh, it's interesting because you can reflect now, and maybe if we have this conversation in another 10 years, it'll be different again. I think I've probably mellowed over the journey. I think when I was younger and I was at REA, we were at the height of the internet growth period in, from 2000 to 2010, and it was like a kill or be killed kind of mentality, and very aggressive. We were building businesses, and we weren't sure of what this roadmap was going to look like as it unfolded. So there was no forward-looking understanding of where it was going to land. So every day was like you lived it like it was your last, because you were building something where there was no handbook on how this was going to look. And I think over the years I've mellowed a bit, and I remember when I had my first daughter, and I came back to work after it, and after a few days, my EA, my assistant, said to me, "Wow, you've really changed. So you've really mellowed."
A few days.
Maybe children mellowed me a bit, but look, I've always had a style of being very straightforward. I don't know if you can see over my shoulder. We have a very open plan office. We don't have desks. We have desks. We don't have offices, rather. And I've always been about empowering people. I've always been very impressed by people who are motivated and are passionate. And I guess understand that when you are a leader or you want to build businesses, it's not a short-term idea. And we try to think very long-term. And that can often help you overcome moments that would otherwise seem, panicky or stressful. And I think if I think back, maybe my style back then was to live every day. So I lived every moment of stress. Whereas today, kind of, you know what? This is a long game. Those moments that you think are consequential and you think are really negative, they're never as bad as you think. And if you can keep your eye on the long game, it's a much calmer existence. You can make long-term decisions, and you can have that long-term strategy without losing yourself in the moment. And I think that's probably been a fundamental change in how I've thought, perhaps to when I was younger.
Now, Shaun, you work with entrepreneurs globally. You have a good read on leadership styles, entrepreneurs, what to look out for, and you're based in Malaysia. How do Malaysian entrepreneurs stack up against their regional counterparts and also their global counterparts?
It's a really interesting question, because Malaysia is such a tapestry of different cultures and language, and it kind of presents itself in entrepreneurs. And many entrepreneurs here have been schooled overseas. And I think that experience when they come back here and start businesses is really powerful. I think it's a shame that they have to go overseas to get that experience. I think it's a shame that the education system here is not more geared toward producing entrepreneurs that can be part of the ecosystem from day one. And I think that's where you get a lot of value in a tech ecosystem, is when you've got graduates coming out of school in their garage doing startups. It's a really vibrant way to cultivate new digital businesses. I think challenge for Malaysia is so many people feel the need to leave to get educated or to get experience. I would love for that to change, and I'd love it if the powers that be would invest more in education here. And I think that is the biggest predicator to success for entrepreneurs is high quality education. It saddens me that so many people leave to pursue that. I understand it. But what it does, I guess the plus side is people come back to Malaysia with quite worldly views, and they've seen a lot of businesses overseas. They've seen successful businesses, and quite often they come back to start a version of that. So I find that class of entrepreneurs super impressive. I think there's always a risk with entrepreneurs that people get obsessed with that they're in the business of startups. You know, I'm a startup guy. What do you do? I do startups. What business do you do? I don't know, just startups, right? And I think that mentality of being a startup guy is kind of a false economy, because, as I was just saying before, great businesses take time to build. They take focus, they take commitment. You're going to have some stressful, difficult moments, and you've got to play the long game. And I think the more entrepreneurs locally that can stop obsessing about being a startup guy and stop thinking that they're in the business of raising money. You know, you're actually in the business of building a solution for a problem, which requires money and requires you to start it. But the more you can focus on the solution the problem you're trying to solve, and the fact it's a long-term commitment. Stop this BS about, you know, I'm a startup guy, or, you know, publishing articles about yourself on LinkedIn that's about the latest round of money you raised. I want to know what it is you're doing and your problem you're solving, and how you're making society function a bit better by what you're doing. And I think if I'm an entrepreneur, my goal, my drive is to make something in society work better than it did before, and to solve problems for consumers or businesses. And I think that's a connect that I think in Malaysia could be better understood by the entrepreneurial community. So I think many amazing people. You're getting a lot of startups. I mean, here at Mid Valley, more by accident than design, this has ended up being the home to quite a few digital businesses, right? And that hasn't been through a government program. It hasn't been through an orchestrated event. It's been a cluster that's formed, and it's really impressive seeing, you know, young entrepreneurs understand that when you want to grow a business, when you want to build a solution, it's not about being a startup guy. It's not about raising money. It's actually building a great business. And I think the more people that can do that, the better ecosystem we'll have here.
Shaun, another criticism of Malaysian entrepreneurs is really the fact that maybe they're not aspiring to build great companies or unicorns. They're kind of happy with just, you know, catering to the domestic market and maybe going out to Singapore or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because a lot of people, if an entrepreneur was building a business and they got 20% of the way into it and someone came and offered to buy it, 9 out of 10 would probably sell it, and that would be the end of that journey. And I think sometimes that's the difference between saying, well, am I building a long-term business, or am I building a startup to sell? And if you're in the business of building startups to sell, it's a pretty unfulfilling vocation. And I think about our own experience, where we took our property from having a market cap of about 10 million to about 600, and it was acquired by the REA group.
Yeah.
And we thought that was a really good outcome, and clearly it was. I mean, that was a great effort by a whole range of people that contributed to that. With FDV now, we're roughly at that same market cap that we took our property to. But we still see ourselves as much closer to the start than the end. Like, we want to build a big business. And I think our understanding of that has been through going through the iProperty experience and building what was a big business. But, you know, next time around we say, well, you know what, it felt big, but I think we can build bigger. And that takes time. We've been at this for 6-7 years now, and we think it's going to be another 6-7 years. And that's a large chunk of your career. So I think if you look at the great entrepreneurs and you look at the really successful entrepreneurs, they go the distance. They go the distance and they build big, great businesses. As you say, that aren't just KL, Klang Valley, or the Peninsula. They're actually regional, and in some cases global. And like we're trying to be global. We started out from day one thinking of ourselves as a global business, and that's really how we want to measure ourselves.
Now, Shaun, final question. What are 3 key business lessons that you can share, that you've learned so far, that you'd like to share with other business leaders?
I would say, number one, and I touched on it before, when you're faced with adversity and stress and you think something's really awful, it's never as bad as you think. And you're going to wake up tomorrow and the world will spin, the lights will come on, and you'll get back to work and you'll think about something else. So I've always found stressing about the moment is really unproductive. And if you can, again, this goes back to this long view. I think if you can just keep your eye on the long game, a lot of the daily irritants go away and you have a much happier life. I think work-life balance is one that's really struck me, maybe through COVID, where I've realised over the past 12 months that you can have a bit of both. You know, working 15-hour days is not a badge of honour. You actually are going to be a much happier, more successful entrepreneur if you can have a balanced life. Now, that's not for everyone, but I think it's just a really healthy choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing is, and this is, I've been very lucky in this sense, is just try and surround yourself with successful people. Try and surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, who have done more than you, who probably have seen more than you, and probably know more than you. Don't ever let yourself get sucked into having to be the smartest guy in the room. Always surround yourself with super smart, successful people. I've been really lucky on that front. I've had people around me that are wildly successful and super smart, and I learn stuff every time I talk to them. And I hope that goes on forever. So I always say to young entrepreneurs, you don't have all the answers, and it doesn't matter if you don't. You're not supposed to. Surround yourself with people who might, and you'll go a long way.
Now, Shaun, it's been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time to be on the show.
Pleasure, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm Brian Fernandez, and I've been speaking to Shaun Gregorio, CEO and founder of Frontier Digital Ventures, on BizTech's CEO Conversation Show. Check out www.biztech.asia for business and technology conversation.